Welcome to the Backstage Creative. My name is Krista Copper. This podcast focuses on the people who work behind the scenes of theater. Today is my conversation with music director Anna Murphy. Anna is based in Minneapolis, and I lived in Minneapolis for about 2 years, and so I had a chance to work with Anna on a really fun show, The Toxic Avenger, which was just what a silly show. I enjoyed it. Thank you for listening. I appreciate it. There's so many resources out there. There's so many podcasts. There's so much music. There's so many TV shows and movies that you could be watching. But the fact that you are listening to this podcast really means a lot to me. I'm just sitting here in my apartment by myself talking into this microphone, and it's kind of crazy to think about that people are actually gonna listen to this, on a run or when they're walking or cleaning the house or doing all the things that you do when you listen to a podcast. And so it is an honor that there are people listening to this. A lot of work goes into this, and a lot of love and time and energy goes into this podcast on my end. So I am grateful for you, the listener, because I would love to have these conversations without having the excuse of a podcast. And I would hope that I would have some of them, but I wouldn't probably be having near as many of them without the deadline of putting out a weekly podcast. So it's great motivation for me to reach out to people, and when people listen to it, that gives me even more motivation to keep going with it. So thank you. Here we go. Here's my conversation with Anna Murphy. I like to start with people's background, like where you're from, how you got into theater, how you got into playing the piano and getting into music directing, and where you are now.
Okay, well, I was born in Kansas, and I grew up in Kansas, and my dad has a piano store in Kansas, so I guess I kind of got forced into it through that. But I started piano when I was 5, and I started playing violin actually when I was 7. So I did both of those all through high school, and it was like a battle for which one was which. I went to college in Nebraska, kept doing piano and violin there. I got officially a major in piano, or my degree in piano, but I also did all the coursework for a violin major. And then I did my thesis about why I was like salty for not being allowed to do both. And in college, I started playing. Well, I guess in high school, I had started playing for the school musicals and like for the show choir. But then in college, I did that a little more and started getting involved with the community theater. But it wasn't until I moved to Minneapolis that I really got into music directing professionally. And Minneapolis is where I am now. And yeah, that's the quick background.
Why Minneapolis? What brought you to Minneapolis?
Minneapolis was an impulse decision, actually. While I was in Nebraska, so I was working for these different like community theaters, and just like after work, I would go and do like I was a rehearsal pianist. I was never a music director there, and I was working at like a local music like arts academy, and I was playing for weddings, and I was working at the Performing Arts Center, and all of these different like balancing a million jobs. Oh, and I was a middle school accompanist. And that turned into 12-hour days of playing piano, and my back was a disaster, and I lived at the chiropractor, and it was a lot. And so I actually moved to Minneapolis. I had a really rough day with somebody that I'd worked a lot with in Lincoln, and I just kind of like had a little breakdown to myself on my way to South Dakota for a family reunion. And my cousin was like, Anna, I feel like you just need a change. I feel like you should just move to Minneapolis. And at this point, I'm pretty sure she was kidding, but I did it. So I literally went back and packed up my stuff and moved like a week later. And I moved to Minneapolis to quit music, actually. So that didn't work. But I came here because it had an art scene, and I knew I wanted to be involved with the art scene and the music scene and the theater and all of this. But I think when I came here, I was thinking of like arts administration or like getting to just know artists and do something else during my life, but have that in my radar. One day I was in like a Facebook pianist thing group, and I got a blast for somebody that needed a rehearsal pianist for a rehearsal that night. And I was available, so I said sure. And they said, okay, we're doing the last 5 years. And I was like, okay, I don't know what that is. So I listened to it on Spotify like all day long. And then I showed up and I sight read the whole freaking show at rehearsal. And they were like, you should come on tour with us. Do you want to be the music director? And I said, sure.
I love talking to people who have just like packed up their life and moved to a new town because I've done that uh 3 times.
Oh, I love it.
I think it's 3 times now. What advice would you give to people who are moving to a new town? Maybe they don't know anyone, maybe they know 2 people. What advice would you give to them?
Half of the reason that my life turned around, or I don't want to call it turned around, but like I think the way that my life ended up going in this direction is because when I came here, I was not taking myself seriously or like too seriously. Like I knew who I was and I knew what I cared about, but that was like the forefront. It wasn't like, I want to get this job, I want to meet this person so I can do this thing. It was like, I just want to be in a place where they do music and hopefully somebody's going to appreciate that someday. So I just kind of got out and like talked to people. Just if somebody was like, oh yeah, you play piano, I have a kid that played piano for 2 weeks, and it's like, okay, great, this is a conversation we're going to have now. And you have those all the time, I feel like, as a musician. Like, do you ever run into that?
Yeah, all the time. Or, "Oh, I played bass for a year in 5th grade," when you're talking
Yeah,
to someone who's like 40 and you're like, "Okay."
exactly. But everybody wants to tell you about their niece who's on their first year of lessons, and their cousin who they're pretty sure maybe went to college for piano, or it might have been cello, but it was definitely something.
Uh-huh.
And you fall into these conversations and like everybody's interested and wants to talk about it and wants to connect you with the other person that they think is the most connected to that thing. And that has been like a really interesting way to network. Like it's not the way that I would have ever thought that I would meet people, but it has made me some really like fun and interesting friends through the time here.
Mhm. Mhm. And I feel like Minneapolis, of all the places I've lived, has probably been one of like the toughest scenes to break into, just in terms of I don't know. I can't quite put my finger on it, but I know Minneapolis for me was a struggle just getting into the scene and getting connected and like getting gigs that paid. um, I don't know. Have you found that?
To a certain extent, I remember, so I did that quick little tour. Well, it was fun because I when I came here, I ended up starting working in immigration law, which is like a separate life to talk about. But I when I got this tour gig, I was like, I'm gonna go on tour. I'm a musician again. Like, here we go. So I went into work and I was like, I have to quit. And they were like, no, it's okay. Just take your like, well, it was like a month-long thing. They're like, that's fine. Just leave for a month and come back. It's fine. So I left and I came back and there was just nothing again. I had my thing and it was over. And I think that's a thing that's like unique in a way to the music world that doesn't make sense to the rest of the world. So everybody at the law firm was like, okay, cool. Like you did your 3 weeks of your hobby and now you're back to your real job. So like, welcome home. And then I don't think I had a gig for like another 8 months. And somebody posted on some website somewhere that they needed a pianist. And I was like, cool, I did that once. And that's how I started working with MMT, which is how I met you. And then I ended up working with them, for a couple seasons. Or, I mean, I still work with them. It just doesn't feel like I do because we haven't been in live theater in 70 years, apparently. It's interesting because breaking into something is not like a one step process. And I
Mhm.
feel like the people that I met doing that very first show, like there's two people cast in the last 5 years. So like I met a little tiny group of people and it was just like a vacuum and then it ended. And then I didn't come into contact with those people hardly at all. The next show had nothing to do with any of them. But then like you get in a couple years and you just like accidentally find a couple jobs and then all of a sudden you accidentally made this huge network of people and you accidentally know all of them and it's great. But it takes such a different line. Like it doesn't feel like networking. It feels like a series of things that happen to you and you just hope that it works.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It takes so long, and there's so many factors too, like every city is so different. Like there's cultural things going on that maybe aren't quite apparent right away. If there's a huge music school in town, like that's where most of the gigs go to. Like there's just so many things that go into breaking into a scene. I don't know. I think it's interesting. It's interesting to think about. I think about it a lot. So
Absolutely. And one thing actually that I've noticed kind of recently is that like my entire training was classical. Like I by the end of high school when they were asking me to play for the musicals, it was because they knew that I could play piano, but I was so snooty about it. I was like, I'm sorry, I'm a classical pianist. I've never heard of this bye bye birdie. Like, what do you want from me? And so getting into this has been like a weird switch, and I love it so much, and I'm so glad that I got into it. But I've really noticed that my background is not the background of a lot of music directors that I've met. A big majority, at least that I've noticed, of music directors in my life are people who were like actors first, and they were like actors and singers, and then they were like, actually, I feel like we could do this better from the bench. Like, I feel like there are things that could be changed, and I play piano and I can do this. So it's really interesting also just to see how the dynamics between like who you were first, like what you did and what parts of it you are interested in, and like who are the people you know, and how does that shape the way that you do your job and the way that you approach your job. That has been an interesting thing to discover along the way, because I think that in the classical world I just expected like, oh yeah, you took lessons and then you went to these competitions and then you like everything is very orderly and it feels like everything goes in the same order, but here it doesn't.
mm-hmm. Yeah, that's been a really fun thing about doing this podcast is you hear everyone's backgrounds and no one got into theater the same way. I mean, a lot of people did start as actors and then decided it wasn't for them, but and as far as like musicians go, I've some musicians come from like a jazz background and some come from a classical and some didn't go to school at all, and some people are kind of like largely just kind of self-taught musicians that have stumbled into theater and developed the skills. And so I think
Yeah,
that creates such a rich environment, because everyone comes from such different backgrounds. Like I think it makes it a lot of fun.
definitely. I agree.
Coming from a classical background, what were some of the things that you needed to learn to be a music director?
I was always a very good sight reader in the classical world. Like I would just sight read at my lessons instead of practicing for way too much of my youth, which that part specifically has come in handy for like, oh, there's thunder, for like tiny bits of the process. Like the audition process is really helpful because I have that. But then if you look at so many musicians in like with the jazz background or with the like any sort of like playing in a local band or something where they have a lot of like improvisation that I can't handle to save my life, and like having to come up with ways to even vamping and like working around the weird stuff that goes on when you're in the middle of a live situation that you're not in control of to a
Mm-hmm.
certain extent. I mean, I guess I'm supposed to if I'm the music director, but like there's so many things that are happening on stage and around you that the classical control that I was used to,
Mm-hmm.
I had to let go of it and come up with the things that work around me. So I know that there are a lot of people I work with that have such better like jazz chops or rock, like all the rock musicals and pop musicals out there. Learning to comp has been like so weirdly above my head. Like everybody talks about it like it's this chill and easy thing, and I'm like, what are you doing and what are the notes that you're playing? There's a lot of, especially coming from, or especially considering all the people who come from their like vocal and acting background, I feel like I've always had a lot to learn from the actors about like what do you feel comfortable doing with your voice. Like I didn't take voice lessons. I was a pianist and I don't know what you're talking about sometimes. I feel like I've taken a lot of big lessons from the actors, and especially the actors that have turned into music directors, on like how to be a productive vocal coach and a helpful vocal director in terms of like what do these people need to hear from me and what is just me saying things to appease myself. Where is my line in terms of telling you how to sing a song versus how to interpret a song versus how those things work together. I think there's been a lot of like uphill climbing in that regard, but it's been a nice kind of climb because it's like collaborative, not in a sense that like, oh, we're like a team and we work together, but like we're a team and we have to make each other sound better. So we are going to do absolutely everything we can to make each other look good.
Mhm.
It's such a mutually beneficial thing. And I love that about it.
And I'm sure that helps, like, people wanna work with someone who has that openness, right? Who's not so dictatorship about everything and,
I hope so.
um yeah, that's a fine line. I like people in leadership positions, like, yes, you wanna collaborate and work with people and but at like, someone's gotta make a decision, you know? Someone's gotta say, "Okay, this is how it's gonna go."
Yeah, for sure. And I don't know, I'm sure you can also attest to sometimes when you are that person who has to make the decision, not only do you have to make the decision, but you have to figure out the way to communicate it to the person. And especially sometimes when you're like the woman in the room, or there are a lot of situations where it gets very difficult to figure out how to navigate doing your job on top of also how to do your job.
Mhm. How do you communicate with all of these different people, right? Like, I would imagine communicating with actors is very different from communicating with musicians, which is different from talking to the stage manager, which is different from talking to the director. So, how do you navigate all of these different like communication styles that you have to wade through?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's something that I don't think I have nailed yet. I don't think I can give like a solid this is how you're supposed to do it, because I think that it changes with every group that you work with and the dynamic of your show. And I know there are times where I probably could have done it a lot better than I managed to. But I it is a really interesting balance just because like when you're in the room, like when you're in your production meeting, you're the only person a lot of times that knows what you're talking about in terms of music direction. Like the lighting designer doesn't really have to care about your main stage setup, but there's a lot to like you guys are both working on this thing together, and it's a very like professional teamwork, like moving forward this is what we need to do. But then when you're with the cast, like you have to have a rapport with your cast and you have to be able to, they're doing something that is very personal to them and public to everyone, so you have to trust their vulnerability above anything else. So it's interesting trying to balance those hats as well as also like if you have a band, if you have a pit you're in charge of, you have to be able to run that in what's usually a much shorter period of time, and usually ends up being like, I don't know, I always feel like more of a dictator in the pit. Like
Mhm.
I can be calm and collaborative with a lot of things, but I feel like there's a certain level with I have been doing this show for, 3 weeks or a month or however long you've been putting it on your feet. And you have 2 days before the Pits and Zits probe. And it's like, this is what we're doing. I don't care if you think that this should be 4 VIPs because that is not how many VIPs it takes them to go up the stairs. And I cannot comment further on this. So I always feel like it's funny when the pit shows up and you're like a different person than you've ever been, trying to keep everything, all the hats on top of each other. But I think that's what makes it fun.
I mean, as a pit musician, I like it when I go in and the music director is like, "This is how we're gonna do it," because it is like I feel that pressure of okay, opening night is like 6 days away. Like, just tell me what we're doing. I'll get it. I'll figure it out. I mean, I don't know. But I would guess that musicians can be pretty. We can maybe take criticism and like straightforwardness maybe a little better than maybe like actors or maybe designers. I don't know. It seems like
Yeah,
musicians maybe have a little thicker skin when it. I don't know.
I think I know what you're saying, especially, and I think that's a different thing, like based on your background in music. Because I know, like coming out of symphonies, all you do is take nitpicky criticisms, like
Hmm.
20 times a minute in symphony rehearsals. It's like that was an upbo and you're an idiot. But then I know that there are people that don't have that training, and I know I've caught myself in the past being like, doesn't everybody know how to take an upbeat from my one singular nod with no other beat? Like, is this not just clear? And people are like, no, Anna, it's not. Like, you have to do something different. I've caught myself in times when I try to allow the band to have more like they present something and I'm like, yeah, that is a good idea, I think we should try that, and then you put it together and it's like, no, Anna, you should have tried a little harder to think that through before you just let it slide. There is absolutely a point to, especially because like your job, I've been a pit musician so many times, like definitely more than I've been a music director, and your job as a pit musician is to come in and just like make the thing happen. Like you're not in charge of making that many artistic decisions. You just come in
Hmm.
and you like read and you do the thing. You do the artistic decision that is on the page, but it's just like, I just need to produce the thing right now. Tell me how to do it, please. So
Hmm.
I think there is a lot of room for like, it's not like, oh, you did that wrong. It's like, oh, I need it that way. And you're like, okay. Whereas if you say, hey, Jennifer, I need you to not sing like a like baby. I need you to sing like a mad, angry person. And they're like, but I'm not a baby. I don't know.
Uh-huh. As a musician, what are some of your like favorite characteristics of like a really good music director that you just love working for?
Well, so as a rehearsal pianist, I worked with a lot of music directors like through the entire process, which feels a little different from being a pit musician. But in that regard, it's interesting to see how the music director will treat their role as like who's doing the teaching and who's doing the like note correcting and stuff. But then when you get into being a pit musician and coming in and just doing it in that short period of time that we were talking about, I think it's just so nice to have someone who pays attention and understands, you just read this thing for the first time, but this thing is now going to change. And like, I think that there's just a lot of, as serious as you have to be with your pit, there's also a level of like, well, this is stupid. Like, because you really get to know the pit or the music director during the rehearsals, during these like long rehearsals that are so stressful for the music director, because it's the first time that like a million things are happening, but you're also in charge of these people that you weren't in charge of for the last month. And there's a lot of times a ton of humor in the stuff that happens during tech week, and just like being able to trust your music director to take it with like, I don't know, take it with a grain of salt, take it with a smile on their face is very valuable to me.
That trust is so huge. Yeah, if you don't I've been in a lot of pits. Oh, I've been in so many pits. Where where some music directors, you just when you don't trust them, it makes your job so much more harder because there's like this anxiety of like if something goes wrong, I don't trust them to be able to get us out of it without like having to stop the show or something terrible like that.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, and I know I felt as a music director that I did not end up with that trust in time. And that is an awful feeling to have, to just like to know that you're opening in 48 hours and the people sitting behind you or next to you or in front of you or whatever, like if it messes up, they're just gonna bail. They're like not in it. And the hard thing is it's never like really their character. It's just like you got it or you don't sometimes.
what are ways that you think builds trust between a music director and their pit or a music director and the actors?
There's a lot of vulnerability in music specifically where like you do express yourself in a way that is unique to music, and I think that it's easy to take things very personally as a musician, like not because of like personality or anything, but because like you are putting your own thing, you put so much into your music that you can't help but feel a little bit when somebody like criticizes it. And I think that in like really establishing a rapport with your pit, like whichever seat you're in, there's a lot to be said about just like being open about like what the expectations are and like hoping that they're still fun and like keeping keeping the priority on like the thing that you're all putting together, because it is ultimately like in a week we're going to be doing this thing just 5 times a week for the next 3 weeks and then it's going to be over, or maybe we're going to be doing it 5 times a week or 8 times a week for the next 6 years. Like we'll find out. The thing with the pit is that like you're not the thing that people came to watch. Everybody
Hmm.
came to watch a musical and they know that you're going to be there, but they forget that you're there the entire time.
Mhm.
And sometimes they don't know you're there. Like, honestly, I'm always shocked to know that people don't know you're there. As a pit, when you know that, like, you functioning as, like, one singular, like, amoeba object, like, you have to do your thing, and then it's gonna make the whole thing work, and you all like, everybody really invests in that, and everybody can really, really come to enjoy that, and at the same time, there's, like, a little bit of fun in the pressure that, like, "Oh, if we biff it, then there goes the night, like, everybody remembers we're here." There's, like, a little bit of a magic in remembering that if you do your job, it is a new experience for, like, all of these people out there.
Mhm.
I don't know how it really balances the rapport. I don't know how it fixes that relationship, but I think that there's something just, like, knowing that there's something bigger that you're all gonna be doing is nice.
Mhm. Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think it's a weird thing. I trust the music director who trusts me to trust them. It's kind of like this circle of like I trust you and you
Yeah.
trust me because I trust you because you trust me. I really value music directors who trust me to do my job and just kind of let me be like just let me do my job and don't make it harder.
Absolutely. Well, and I think that's actually a really good point. My job is to be a pianist and a director and like whatever else. Like I have a lot of parts of my job, but that doesn't mean that the reed player doesn't have to play 19 things over the course of the next 2 hours, or that the bass player didn't have like 7 weddings to play for this week and they're still showing up to play like a different version of the bass than they had to play all the other times. We all have so many parts of our job that we bring together in order to do the thing, and we just all I don't know how to do those things, and I trust that you're going to. And that is a really important part of it.
So how do you handle stress either when you're in a rehearsal or when you go home at night?
I had this conversation a lot last year because I way overbooked myself. I'm such an overbooking person. And I had so much fun with it and it was great, but everybody I talked to was like, "Anna, what are you doing?" So I was working at the law firm 40 hours a week. I would go in at 7:30 and I would leave at 4:30 and then I would go to rehearsal that started at 5 and then I would leave rehearsal at 10. And I was doing two shows at once on top of the job. So it was stressful, right? But the thing that was kind of nice about it, and I think everybody thought I was just like a sociopath or something for enjoying it so much, but I immigration was really stressful last year. Like it was a really bad, not fun time to work in immigration. And so I would stress and stress and stress and stress. And then at 4:30, I was like, oh crap, I forgot how to run main stage. Like I need to make sure I talk to these 7 people about like that one weird light and the cue that I can't see and the person who's singing the wrong harmonies. And it's just like immediately switching into a completely different thing. By the end of rehearsal, or especially by the end of the shows, I like forgot that I had a job in immigration. And then I would go back to work the next day and I was like, I have a musical. What's the musical? Everything here is so stressful, which is actually not managing stress. It's just piling on so much stress that you only can remember one of them at a time. But that's my personal experience.
Okay,
I hope everyone gets a lot of lesson out of that. Just pick a job that is similarly stressful.
sure.
No, I do. I guess to be fair, I do think this year I really put effort into trying to consume as much theater as I was putting out, which in a way is still like, oh yeah, you go to a show and you're like looking at what everybody's doing and paying way too much attention to the music and everything. But it is a way of like learning about your job without being under fire while you're doing it. That for me has been nice. Like it doesn't feel stressful to me to be watching other people do musicals, but it still feels like I'm a part of it. But then also that fell apart because of coronavirus. So it's weird with the like influx of all of the virtual online stuff and how everyone now has like an opinion on whether we should just go online forever or like if we should just start having socially distant theaters where there's only like groups of 2 chairs. It's like I don't want to think about this. Like can we talk about this when I'm not exhausted by the reality that is causing this?
Yeah, live theater, like, we need putting Hamilton on Disney Plus, great, but there's nothing I mean, I haven't seen Hamilton in person, but I'm sure I can guarantee that watching it on Disney Plus is not nearly the same as seeing it live.
Agreed.
So let's talk about having a day job. You're still working for immigration?
I am. I sure am.
I think there's a lot of I mean, I have a so I work for a school, so it's June, so I don't have a
Yeah,
day
yeah.
job right now. But I don't like the stigma around having a day job and how that kind of is kind of viewed as failure or I mean, and I tell myself that narrative in my head sometimes too, so I'm like talking to my own mind as well, but
Mhm.
I think there's a lot of I mean, like sometimes you just at least I feel like I'm failing because I have a day job that has nothing to do with the arts. But I think there's also, I don't know, I'm sure there's positive things about having being an artist and working in something totally unrelated to art during the day. So, what are your thoughts on artists having day jobs?
It's interesting because it does feel like there's absolutely a hierarchy within, I mean, even with like actors and like other theater artists, not just music directors, but it does feel like there is a hierarchy that's not even necessarily like who's better than the other, but it's just there like horizontally, that there are people who are fully, completely music directors. And then there's people who are music directors and piano teachers. Like they have a day job that is corresponding. So they're still a full time musician. But then there's the ones that are like baristas and they're like, oh yeah, they like I work a couple hours a day doing this and I work a couple hours a day doing this. And then there's like a couple of us that just have something that is very different. It's really interesting communicating about it like with people who are theater artists or people who are in similar situations versus people like at work at my day job. 80% of the people that are not musicians that I talk to are like, "Oh, so you're a paralegal and sometimes you play piano for fun." I'm like, "No, that's a different interpretation than how I would describe it." It's like it doesn't feel like a survival job, especially right now because I'm not doing theater, but like it feels like I am a paralegal and sometimes I get to music direct and that bothers me sometimes because I care so much about music theater and I love music theater. And the way that my life has worked out with bailing on work for a little bit to do that tour and then later I bailed on work. I do Stage Door Manor in the summers, so I'll be gone for like a couple weeks or I'll be gone for the a couple months for the whole summer. Every once in a while I'm a full-time musician and a full-time music director and then I come back and then I'm not, and I a lot of people on the outside are like, oh yeah, she took like her little vacation to do her little hobby, like yay. And it is a really weird thing to balance, especially in conversation with other theater people, because sometimes I don't necessarily feel like I fit in with it. And not even necessarily in an exclusionary way, just in a way that I don't feel that I can speak to being a full-time musician anymore. Like I did that for a little while, but it was very different and it was so many jobs at once. It's been an interesting balance to strike. I think mostly just within my own mind and my own concept of what it is that I do and what it is that is my priority in doing all of the things, like why I'm choosing to do each one of them, if that makes sense.
Hmm. Yeah, I agree with that. And I think when you have a day job, it takes some of the pressure off because then you don't have to take every gig that comes your way, like the $30 per service gig, that's 45 minutes away. That's like
Absolutely.
the hours, are like 7 to 11 or so I think when you do have a day job, you can say, that's not really worth my time." And if I was just doing music and having to do those gigs, I think that's how you get burned out, and I think that's how
Yeah.
you lose a lot of your passion is by like trying to scramble to get by. And when you have a day job, you're not there's not as much scrambling.
Absolutely. And I think I kind of caught myself doing that a little in Lincoln. I think that's why I did end up so burned out while I was still there, was because I had a day job at the school. I was an accompanist for the middle school and it was a part-time job, but it was still like most of the day and I didn't have teaching responsibilities or anything, but it was a job that I had that felt like a day job more than any other job I had had at that point in my life. I hadn't found any kind of balance in like saying no to gigs. And actually saying no to gigs is still like a very new thing to me. I think it started like a year ago. um, but like realizing that as much as I like cringe so hard every time someone tells me that it's my hobby because it bothered me a lot. That it is to a certain extent like it's something that I enjoy and it's something that I am able to do at my leisure. Like I could quit if I felt like it. I could not do gigs if I felt like it. And I don't have any obligation to continue as a music director this year. And maybe in 2 years I could come back, you know? It's a weird level of freedom because I also look back at gigs that I've taken. Like if I looked at it on paper right now, I'd be like, I don't know if I am interested in this show. I've never heard of it and the book looks kind of bad. Like I don't like the music in it or, you know, whatever other bad criticism I might come up with that ended up being like really, really good experiences. But at the same time, there are things that I've signed on for or that I've passed over. And I've looked back and I'm like, it is a good thing that the person they chose to do this did this because I don't think that like I would have been able to pull off this concept or that I think they did a really good job with the way that they fixed this main stage rig or whatever. Like it definitely goes both ways.
Yeah. And having insurance is really nice too.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. The other thing though that is like tangentially related to this is that it is really weird as a theater artist and as it's specific in a way to being a music director, but I think it's also specific to a couple other jobs in the industry. In most jobs, in what like the average citizen would consider a job, you do your day job next to a lot of other people that do the same day job. You all have the thing in common and you do it together during the day. Like you're all bankers or you're all lawyers or like the people in your office can relate to your experience. But in theater, like we're all making a show, but I don't talk to other music directors like ever because we all have awful schedules and we're all doing shows all the I mean not now, but you know, like we're
Mhm.
never free on the weekends and we're never free on the evenings and like you don't get to talk to people that do your job and you're just kind of like floating and hoping that you're doing it right and then you like hear that some I don't know I just want to know what people in the world do who are music directors. I want to know if they do the job the way I do the job. I just want to see their rehearsals and see if I am totally wrong.
Yeah, I don't know. Remember if it was in when I was in Minneapolis. I don't know somewhere where I was like, I was talking about like I was frustrated, like I wanted more gigs. And like, oh, you need to connect with bass players, and I was like, but I do theater. I don't know any other bass players.
Yeah, one of you they don't need any more on the team.
Yeah, unless they're doing like a, I don't know, like a Rogers and Hammerstein or
Right,
something, or
right.
super old. But
And it's interesting specifically because I mean there are programs to train to be a theater music director and that is something that at the time I was about to go to college and pick a major was not at all on my radar as something that existed or something that I wanted to pursue. But a lot of music directors that I know are like self-taught. Like you go to a thing and people say, "Oh, you play piano. Do you want to music direct this thing?" And you fall into it and you're like, okay, well, I have a vague understanding of what happens in a musical. Like there is drama, and so I will help with that. And also I will conduct and I will play the piano, and that is my job, right? And you just like see what happens. So I think a lot of it is self-taught, and then on top of being self-taught, it is not a lonely job, but like a job that you can't talk to other people about in the way that you can talk about like being a immigration paralegal to any other immigration paralegal.
that's a good point. Do you have any switching gears? Do you have any routines in your life that help you when you're in the middle of doing a show?
I have found that when I'm doing a show, I always like to get up earlier and I'm always able to get up earlier. And I don't know why that is, but whether it's even like rehearsals or production, I'm able to like get up early and I'll go on it. Like I'll make coffee and I'll go on a walk. And while I'm on my walk, I'll like go through the stuff on like my to-do list, like mentally just run through all of the things that I need to do for like what are the notes I give tonight and like what are the things that I know happened yesterday that didn't feel appropriate to mention yesterday, so I still need to put them on my to-do list and like what thing did I forget to do in main stage and going through just like all of the various portions of it since there are so many and since you do have to be like the like we said earlier the person who talks to the production team versus the cast versus the band and like I feel like waking up after a morning of or sorry after an evening of like rehearsals doing that, waking up in the morning and just like thinking through everything and just placing myself at the point in the middle of it where I feel like I am ready to be is the most helpful part of it for me. I'm a list person. I'm very much a list person, and I'm a like visualizing person. I need to write it down and then I need to stare at it. So I like to map out the things that I do. And that is honestly like more than any routine. That is the part of it that is so important to me.
Anna and I have done a show together. We did the Toxic Avenger, which was so fun. So I wanted to bring up the like women in leadership because I feel well I want to bring it up and I don't want to bring it up because why are we talking about this in the middle in a quarter of the way through the 21st century? But
Yeah.
it still can be a problem. How do you handle the situations where you can tell either the person just doesn't like you or the person has a problem with your authority and maybe it has something to do with their gender, maybe they're just power hungry? How do you handle like that tension when you can tell that someone isn't being respectful to you and you think is this because like I'm a female in this leadership position? What do you do?
That's a tough one. I think that that's another thing that has evolved in my fairly short time as a music director. And I think actually that show might have been the first show that I had a pit in. Now that I think about it, like I did a lot of solo piano music directing, but you got me in my early days of navigating that. And I think that there's a very interesting line specifically for women, and there's so many specifics of it, and it's weird when you have to have these different rapports with these different people and you have to figure out how to balance it. Like you can't just come in and be an authoritarian music director to every single pit without figuring out who they are first. Something I've learned as I go through that is like there are going to be people that don't like me. Like I am a sassy tiny person and I don't make every single person my friend. And I have found that there are times when I need to listen and figure out what it is that's going wrong. It's like invade it or engaging with Facebook trolls sometimes that like there is a time and a place where you have to be like, I get that you feel that way. I don't have like now is not the time for it. Now I have a thing that I have to do and that is put on this show and you're going to be up there. Like, we're all going to be up there. And if you don't do the thing, everybody's going to know. Like, we're going to put on a show together. And whether or not you like me, you got to like the fact that people are going to come see us. And it is, I think the hardest thing for me to balance is how I approach my own personality in those times. I'm a very sarcastic person. I think you know this about me. I don't know how to describe it, but it's a personality where like I'm willing to fight back to people, but I also feel like I have kind of a small or like a listening personality, if that makes sense. I'm really not doing a good job of describing it, but especially early on, found a lot of faults in my own like no, just like you tell me, like, what do you think though? Like, I just feel like maybe it's a little Minnesota, but it's like I think that maybe this would have worked. But like, what do you think? Because I feel like you obviously have a different idea than I do, and I would like to hear it. And I think that this is a good time for us to have a conversation. And it's like, no, we open tomorrow. Like that was not a good time for a conversation. Like play the note and then talk to me about it next week. There's an interesting balance to strike between like being a friend and being like up to make fun conversation in the green room and then walk out onto the stage and be like, this is what we're doing. Sorry, like this is not your place. This is my place and we're going to do it now. And I think that I've made progress on that. And I think that I have a lot of progress to make on that. I just don't see it like in the limited interactions I have had with other male music directors, other music directors in my life, I don't see them having that all the time. And that frustrates me a lot because, I mean, obviously I want to not have those kinds of discrepancies between work, but I have seen definitely differences in response. I have found myself like trying to replicate things and sometimes the wrong things. And it's just like an ongoing battle that depends on the people and depends on, the attitude that they have about your show or your like you as a person or whatever issue it is that they're taking. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I mean, in theater, I'm never in a leadership position, but when I have played in orchestras and have been like the section leader for the bass section or whatnot, I've had some pretty bad leadership experiences, and me being in an authority position over like 8 other bass players who were male, like just really went very wrong. At the time I was really young, and it just was like so discouraging and frustrating, and oh, these guys were my friends, and what's going on? What am I doing wrong? But then I think at some point you just have to say, not everyone's going to like my leadership style. I can only worry about myself.
Yeah.
I can only do my job to the best of my ability and hold myself to the highest standard that I can.
Mhm.
And that's not going to be enough for some people. And I just like, I can't worry about that. Like, I can't take on that burden because it can be, I think, a burden when you feel you're being discriminated against and you're being judged to a much different standard than your male colleagues. But
I think though also along with that, it goes to a certain extent back to the rapport that you have with the rest of your pit and also to like our jobs as pit members. When one person is in charge of 8 people and one of those 8 people is going to have an attitude about it or is going to not listen or is just like genuinely has a problem with it. Like there are a lot of different ways to approach that. But as the other 7 people in the pit, like how are they going to respond to my authority? How am I going to respond to this one person to make them stay on my side? Or like what conversation do we need to have to make sure that all of us get back together? Like sometimes it's not just one person in the pit. Sometimes it's one person that is speaking up and 7 people or 5 people that are defending it, and then the last 2 people are just at a loss and they don't want to be there, and then you just lost the whole thing. So I don't know, I've been thinking a lot about allyship during the state of the world on a like much smaller level than what is happening in the world. There's a lot of allyship that could be had in just like pits and small collaborative things where like you do need to speak up for your leader in the circumstances where someone is being disrespected. There is a lot to say about like standing up for it or like making sure that there's a conversation when there needs to be a conversation. And that's something that I have really appreciated out of members of my pit when I do run into something like that, when people are like, hey, I think that you're doing a good job. Like, I'm sorry this thing happened. I think that the misunderstanding might have been in this, and I hope that we can move forward about that one specific thing. I don't know. I've had a couple experiences where that has been able to turn it around, and I've had a couple of experiences where it hasn't. But at least that relationship came out stronger, and I just don't have to work with that other person anymore. you know,
yeah.
you win some, you lose some.
Yeah. Yeah. Pit dynamics can be so tricky. Like, attitudes are so infectious and they spread so quickly.
Hmm.
My last question I like to ask, advice question. So, advice to young music directors who, want to play professionally, want to do the thing. What advice would you give them?
I think that engaging with a community is a great step. I think that the theater community is one that is very open to teaching people and loves to know that people want to learn about it. Like I've always, even on the level of like Broadway stars, I've appreciated that, like, a lot of times they come out and do stage door and like talk to the people that want to like talk to them after they saw their show. Whereas like you don't get that level of interaction with Brad Pitt after you see something in the movie theater. But I think that like going to talkbacks after shows, you can like engage with the people who just put on this thing, or like showing up just to like community events where they're there, or like sticking around after the show at a local theater. You get a lot of exposure to people. Like if I'm in high school, and I'm a pianist, and my friend writes songs or like wants to write a musical, there's so much to be had in like fostering relationships with people who are learning to navigate the world at the same time that you are.
Mm.
And I think that a lot of the friends that I've made and a lot of the valuable relationships that I've had are with people as we're learning to do this job, especially because it is something that you don't like, once you're in it, you're not collaborating with other people that do it. So I just think that conversation is a really helpful part of it, and just like catching up with people and like learning about what they do. Involving yourself in the community has been, at least for me, the most helpful thing. If you're a singer or an acting singer, making friends with a pianist is excellent for both of you because you can make like recordings and you can learn from each other and you can work with each other. And I think that the nice thing with the theater community is the interconnection and the drive that like we all want all of us to succeed. Like even if we're competing for the same role or the same gig, I always see people like out to support each other in their other show and like hoping that this other person gets their call back. And it's a very supportive community and a great one to just get ingrained in any way you can.
The music for the Backstage Creative was improvised and performed by Ian Leroy, and the logo was designed by Zach Rimbold.